So today I have Asherah Allen with us today. She is one of our co-authors, and she wrote our chapter 13, which is called The First Healer. And then she also did, in our section on rites, rituals, and ceremonies, she did chapter 25, which is Releasing into the River ceremony. So we'll be talking a little bit about that later. Asherah, welcome to this interview. Welcome to this kind of dialogue we're going to have to get to know you a little bit better.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark. It's such an honor to be here with you and to kind of reconnect after the initial release of this still very much timely book.
Yeah, it's been 5 years, and it was actually Asherah who mentioned when I started doing this, putting us back out there to do the relaunch with stuff. She says, "You know what? You should do some of these interviews." And I was like, "Okay, I'll do it." So these are all because of you, Asherah. So thank you so much for that. As I mentioned before we got started here, it's actually been really so interesting and fun for me because in the short 1,250 word stories or messages that we share in here, there's only so much of the author that we get, in this more expanded view here. It kind of gets a little bit into the inside world, so that those folks who read a story go, "I want to know more about Asherah. I want to find out more about her." You can now, after this, be able to go and spend an hour with us learning a little bit more about what makes you tick and how you connecting with nature and all that good stuff. So I'm very excited about it, and thank you again for that gift.
Absolutely.
So as you mentioned, it's been 5 years since we launched this book, and I'm curious, a lot of things change in time, right? And I think especially, at least for myself, as I get older, every 5 year chunk seems to be some major changes and adaptations and reinvention of myself. So I'm curious what might have changed for you over this last 5 years as far as how you connect in nature. Are you doing anything different there? Has obviously COVID has thrown, we're now in May of 2021 and have gone through, hopefully we're on the downside of the COVID situation, but it's been an interesting year and a half for all of us across the world. So I'm curious, has anything changed? Has anything kind of come to you that's different than it was 5 years ago?
Yeah, so when the book initially came out, I was living in a condo, and now I have a small piece of land of my own, and it's an acre and a half, and it's so my daily interaction with nature is very different, feeling like I'm on a piece of land that I'm really grounded on. And I was connected to the land that the condo was on, but I didn't feel the sense of stewardship quite as much. And so I have this daily relationship now with this small parcel of land, and I really feel like I'm investing more of my own energy into it and getting to know it as a being. So yeah, I would say that's the first thing that comes to mind that shifted a lot in the last 5 years.
Yeah, that can be huge with that. So a couple of things kind of piqued my interest there. You're talking about stewardship, so I'm curious what that means to you, and also creating a relationship with the land. I think it goes deeper than more than I'm here doing some stuff. So if you're willing, tell me more about both those kind of concepts and what that really means to you.
Yeah, happy to. So for me, stewardship means that for the period of time that I'm here on this land, I view myself as a caretaker of that land. And I really don't believe that land belongs to me just because I'm paying taxes on it. It really belongs to all of us, but I view myself as the caretaker of that particular parcel. And so for me, being an animist and a pagan, getting to know the land means getting to know the actual spirit of the land, to get to know the spirits of the trees here, which usually means just getting still and quiet and spending time and just listening and seeing what comes. And I receive information through a lot of the clairs, clairsentience, clairaudience, and I just wait for those messages to come and develop relationships that way. And also with the beings here on the land, we have a mated pair of hawks at the back end of our land. That's really, really special. We've had bear and deer and fox, and I'm not even really in the country. I'm sort of on the edge of the burbs in a wild area, so that feels really fortunate that even when I had the condo, we still had wildlife. So I feel blessed that wherever I've lived, pretty much I've still had wildlife.
Yeah, and that sounds really obviously important to you. And as you're mentioning, connection with nature. I certainly understand the listening to nature more than metaphorically. I mean, really listening as the trees speak to me, as the hawks speak, right? And I'm not sure I'm sure you've got an animal totem of some sort, or maybe several.
Hmm.
For mine, it's deer and raven. And so when they show up and how they show up, I pay attention to them.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. It's those, they're all like signs and symbols, and actual beings, right? So I feel like they communicate in a two-way street with us if we're willing to extend our energy.
Yeah, what I find so funny in today's world is that because we're still so science driven and have been for the last, 400 years or so, that the science is the only real God out there. If I
Mm-hmm.
can't touch it, measure it, repeat it exactly over and over again, it doesn't really exist. And
Mm-hmm.
yet our culture longs for, if you throw anything out there, you put Aztec behind any kind of thing that's out there. You write a book and it's like, the Four Agreements, Aztecian, the old Toltecian, information. Oh, I got to get that because that's got to be, they knew so much more than we did. And something Native American, and that's going to be something super sacred. So I want to grab a hold of that and learn what they knew. Or Aboriginal, the Aboriginal folk peoples, it's like, oh, their information and wisdom is that's where the sacred, the secret stuff is held. And it's true. It's true. And we also have access to all of that today.
Yes.
What they knew is exactly what you're talking about there, Asherah, is about becoming still and paying attention and listening, and not thinking that we're at the top of the totem pole there per se, that we're part of the community. I had a really great conversation with Cheryl Conklin, one of our other co-authors, earlier in the week, and she was talking about, for her, which is really cool, is that she's no longer kind of gardening from the standpoint of I'm putting you here and doing this. She's gardening from listening, kind of what you're saying there. I'm guessing there is like,
Mm-hmm.
put me here. I need to be close to this, and move me
Yes.
over here. And she says, usually from her perspective in the past, she's been kind of at the center of the spoke of the wheel there. She's the center of the hub essentially, and everything else is about her. So everything else feeds to her. And she says now she's become part of the community, and she's no better or worse or anything than any of the other spokes on the wheel. And she even said, she goes, I don't know who's or what is at the center of the hub there, but we're all listening and being pulled by it. And I love that vision when we're talking about this, because people who don't know us, who pick up the book and go, these are a bunch of cuckoos here, and the stuff they're writing was like, wait a second, that's not true. Most of us are very well educated. We're not like on the fringe of society necessarily, but we interact and have interacted. We kind of dance in two worlds oftentimes. So I invite those of you who think this can't happen, that trees can't talk to you, that nature doesn't have a spirit to it, to give it a chance to do what one of our authors, Kyle, talked about, and do the non-practice of just going out in nature and really putting yourself in there and opening to it. Again, I keep using the metaphor or the quote by Henry Ford, that if you believe you can or you can't, you're right. So I've used this several times in our interviews here because I think it's so pertinent to what we're talking about here, is that if you think nature can actually speak to you, if you think it might have some messages for you that might help your life, then you're likely to get that information. If you believe that there's no way in hell and that that's all make believe, then you're going to be right about that also, because nature needs you to be vibrating at its frequency to be able to plug into it. So
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, I would say that be willing to imagine that connecting with nature and actually having a two-way conversation is just a lost art, a lost language that we can reenact at any time. And I think if we engage, even through our imagination to start, that still can get us there. It's just the willingness to be open to the idea that it's possible. And look, even if it's all make believe, it sure as heck makes life more interesting to enter into that. And so, what harm is actually done, really? And back to the science thing, I just want to say that in one of my spiritual lineages, we actually don't make a distinction between science and magic. And many of the principles of magic we see iterated in science. And so the two don't have to be at war with one another. And I'm a total skeptic, actually, but at the same time, I'm willing to believe. And so we have these different parts. We have our rational part that wants to break everything down. We have a wild nature that understands things without understanding them, without really knowing them. We just know. And we have a spiritual nature that is already connected and gets it all and doesn't need it explained and doesn't need it experienced. We already know. And so we can enter into our relationship with nature through any of those avenues of our etheric anatomy, so to speak. And so, yeah, I would just say be willing to believe, be willing to play. And if you engage from that part of yourself, that wild nature again, that's childlike, that's a great doorway in. When you were a child, many of us remember talking to quote unquote make believe friends. Now, maybe they were, maybe they weren't, maybe they were real to some extent. They were to us then. And I think many of us have seen that in children. It's like they're actually connecting with something there. And so, yeah, just be willing to go into that part of you that's childlike, and you'll find that a lot happens then. And yes, back to what you were mentioning about the author who said she was gardening and, you know, no longer just puts things, but asks, where do you want to be? That happened to me when I was at Findhorn Foundation in Scotland. They suffered a fire recently this year, by the way, if you want to give to them.
That.
They still are really looking for help there. So please give. They're an amazing organization, some 50 plus years old. But when I was there doing Experience Week, which I write about in the book, we were taught to actually commune with the plants and sit there again, get still. And it's amazing, after a period of time, you can hear the plants communicate to you. And yeah, at first, there's the rational mind that says, this is BS, this can't be happening, I'm just making this up. But then the voice can keep coming and get stronger. What cinched it for me, for my skeptic, was finding out later that the information I heard was legit, that the plant had asked to be planted next to things that were known to be beneficial for it, and not to be planted near things that weren't. And I wasn't much of a gardener at the time, that I had no way of knowing that. So be willing to believe, and then see what happens, and verify. There's nothing wrong with that. So yeah, it is a good way for us to garden, and it's completely different. The other thing I would say, you were pointing to being a part of nature, is that I feel like that's still a mistake some of us make, because it still creates a little bit of a schism. We're a part of nature. And I think what's more pertinent is to understand that we are nature. Mm-hmm. There really is no separation. Because so long as we have that schism, we enter into that dominion over.
Sure.
And so long as we have dominion over the earth, which I don't mean to affront anyone's spiritual beliefs, because I know that's purported in different world religions, but in my experience, that's half the reason we are where we are today with the earth and climate disaster, you know, is that we've maintained this power over structuring rather than understanding that we are nature. And if we really embrace that knowing, then we're going to be less likely to cause damage to the earth.
Yeah, I really like that. And, you know, kind of always brings me back those kind of statements about, you know, being there, paying attention, being part, you know, being of nature. We are nature, like, absolutely. We're not a separate entity. We're not like, we kind of are in our own world, but we are nature. There's no, I mean, there's, you know, and, you know, this is why I keep kind of throwing out there Richard Lou's book, The Last Child in the Woods, and the importance of getting our kids connected in. Because if we don't, there's that place. If you don't have relationship with nature, if you don't have those special sacred places where we've used our imagination to create in, and where there's a part of us that remembers those relationships, right? Even though our logical adult minds want to talk us out of it and say it was all make believe and that wasn't really true. As you're mentioning there, once we get, you know, if you give yourself the opportunity to plug into nature, to really be in alignment with it, it can start talking to you, and it does it in different ways. Some people literally hear it. Some people, it's just a knowledge of that they've gotten it, that there's something that's been downloaded to me. Some people smell things. Some people smell or taste things. Mm-hmm. And so it's different for everyone. And so it's not like when Asherah's mentioning here, it's like, we'll sit in there and you'll hear something. It's like, well, that might not be how it really literally happens. It may be, but it might be different. And for me, the beauty of this is that is being able to discern between the ego mind talking over here and making us special or telling us whatever it is, and then the spirit, which is talking over here. And there at first for me was a very subtle difference between those two, and I had to go, okay, which one is feeding ego and which one is really which one's clear? And like you said, the really amazing things are that happen when things arise that you have no prior knowledge of, like you're saying with the plants there. And that's the verification, right? That's the, okay, this is not my ego talking and I'm just running this through my head. This is something I had no knowledge of. And it told me what it needed, and it was exactly the correct thing. So those are powerful situations. And the beauty about that also is that nobody can take those away. Nobody can argue that with you because it was real. It happened to you. Right. Nobody had to tell you. It's like, it wasn't some intermediary that said this is what happened. It wasn't some guru that you went to. It was you and nature, the two of you, or you and you, right? You as part of nature, going there and opening up yourself to a deeper part of yourself. And I love that.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. Yeah, it's beautiful when we have that kind of experience. And it's true, our experiences, they can't really be argued with. They're ours. And so it belongs to us. And it's not something we need to justify or rationalize. And the more we're willing to just speak about these things, the more we diminish the idea that we must be cockamamie nutso to be talking to trees, right? Because I found that I used to have a lot of judgment when just in my healing arts practice, if I judged someone to be conservative, that they wouldn't be open to maybe the more magical things in the world. What I found was that pretty much everybody is. And in fact, sometimes people who come across as being more immersed in maybe a world that isn't imbued with that are so hungry for it that they're really open. So I think there's a part of the human spirit that universally seeks this kind of connection, wants to believe, even if the rational mind gets in the way. But we can enlist the rational mind. Like I said, it's okay. Enlist the rational mind. Ask it to come on board. Like, please verify. And it does. We don't just have to go through our wild nature to come to understand these things. Go ahead, go through your rational mind and find that, it all links up.
Yeah, I forget what the percent is, like 90 or 95% of people who have had some kind of an unexplained by science, encounter of one sort or another. And we tend to in our primarily scientific based world go, that's an outlier. I'm just going to ignore it, right? I'm just pushing that away out of my reality here so I can deal with in my world that everything works like it's supposed to. And that thing really must not have ever happened. But as soon as somebody opens that doorway, like you're saying, and puts it out there and puts the invitation, all of a sudden it becomes, I've had something like that too. Interesting that you mentioned that. What do you mean that happened? And then all of a sudden that can open doorways, right? Because once you open those doorways and you cross through and you start having those personal experiences, that doorway doesn't shut again. You're in a different world, and your world can turn a bit upside down because everything that you believed can be, now it's just, it's like my world used to be this and now it's this.
That's big.
And once you're in this, so now I'm in this, and it's like, oh my gosh, I think this is really the world, but the truth is it's like this. And in reality, it's like this. And reality keeps going, right? So
ever expanding.
Absolutely. And more layers of who we truly are get unveiled that way. And I like I said, I think that's really wonderful.
It is.
So let's dig into your chapter a little bit. I love, it's so fascinating, Asherah, how every author came at this in a whole different way. And through, I think that's part of the beauty of rereading everything for me. It's like, oh my gosh, there's 22 different voices. Some of us are aligned in particular ways, but everyone kind of has different experiences that are all about coming to our relationship with nature. So in your chapter 13, the first healer, I'm curious, first of all, why that chapter? Why that? Because I know some things about you, so I know it could have been dozens of different ways that you approached this and dozens of different stories that came out. I'm just curious what this was about for you and why this chapter.
Yeah, so as a healer professionally, I'm often looking at the world through the lens of healing. And to me, nature is the first healer. Not we think of people being healers, but nature is really the first healer that there ever was. And nature rejuvenates itself. Nature heals over itself. Nature knows how to heal from a forest fire. Nature knows how to, even with man's involvement, heal from oil spills. And we do play roles in assisting with that sometimes. But that to me was the gateway that really issued forth the way I wanted to approach the chapter, was how nature has healed me and how it can help heal others. So that was the lens. And then I wanted to speak about healing through the lens of the four main directions, the four main elements of earth, air, fire, and water. So I told a series of stories, all relational to my experience with those elements.
Yeah, I really loved especially for me, the one that touched me was your section on air. So what I find really interesting about your chapter there, Asherah, is that you talk about how your daughter Rosalie, when her grandfather passed, that she went into such a time of grief and inner suffering, and it sounds like it was very difficult for her. So you guys took her outside, and all of a sudden you had dragonflies come dive bombing her. Is what I remember reading, right?
Yeah, it was insane because she was very young and one of her first big losses. And so I just felt she needed a shift of environment because I couldn't get her. It's not that I wanted to end her grieving, but she was really coming undone. So we went outside, my husband and I was so glad I had another witness, because it wasn't just like a few dragonflies, which is usually when you see them, it's one or two in an area,
Right.
maybe more, but spread out. And they rounded the corner like a cloud of dragonflies, like literally hundreds of them. And they all flew over right to her, and they were flying over her head and dive bombing her. And she just started giggling. It was unbelievable. And to me, often the spirit world, when somebody has passed, winged ones will be a way that their spirits will somehow, it seems like there's this correlation where spirits can find access through winged ones, because I've heard this through so many of my clients, friends, and family now. When somebody dies, that they'll say they saw a huge bird, or a bird came. I also speak about how when my grandfather passed,
I was going to bring that up actually.
crying,
So
yeah,
like it runs in the family, right? So
yeah, and
I
then
mean,
this bird just hovered like right in front of my nose, and I was like, Granddad? It was just right there looking at me, just hovering. Like, how often does that happen? So I don't know. It just seemed like that was her Opa, that he had found a way, that his spirit hadn't entirely crossed over yet, and found a way to use the manifest world to say hi to his granddaughter and kind of put a smile back on her face. And she was right as rain after that. It was unbelievable.
and so when it happened to yourself as well, did you have a similar thing that kind of was a little bit cathartic for you, even as a young child, that it gave you peace of mind, knowing that, even though the physical presence that we are is past, that the energy and the spirit is still, it's not like it ends with the body.
It was a huge comfort. And I was actually, I think, in my 20s when my
Oh,
grandfather
wow.
passed,
Okay.
and that bird came, and it was still hugely cathartic
Sure.
because I had written this letter to him, like thanking him for everything, and he passed before I mailed it. So I was
Mm.
bereft because I didn't have a chance to read it. And after that sort of spirit visitation from the bird, I thought, I can still read this to him. Some part of him is still going to get this. And I believe that. I believe that those who've passed are still accessible to us.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was just such a sweet, just to read both about from you and Rosalie, both about your experiences, and again with grandfathers, which is interesting. I mean, although, a lot of times it's granddaughters and grandfathers and grandmothers and grandsons, so that makes total sense with that. But it's kind of an interesting place with that. And I agree with what you're saying, is that the winged ones tend to be messengers for us. And Skybear, actually, if you, I'm not sure if you've reread his story, but he talks about that actually in his chapter. Where he's on his motorcycle, and that, I'm not sure if it's a raven or whatever it was, or a hawk that follows him for like miles and miles and miles, until his grief is just run out of him, and then he thanks it, and then it goes, right. He's like, I'm done, and then it goes, and it's like, oh my gosh. I mean, And it's like those happen over and over and over again when you're connected that way and paying attention, right?
Right.
And this is again part of the beauty of how, as you mentioned, nature can heal, the healing aspects of nature when we are in communication, in connection with nature. And I actually made on the book title when I first published it, the with, I made sure it was capital, and the publishers wanted to make it as small. It's like, no, that is absolutely with is a capital. That is the kind of the key, that and the art. Those two components of having the art, meaning we can come from it with the creative ways of coming at nature from so many different directions, and whatever it calls to us individually and how we access it. Yeah, that's really quite special with that. So I
It is.
love that section there. And then tell me a little bit about the water ceremony that you wrote about. Why water? I guess my first question, maybe this completely threw you down a wrong trail, but I'm curious because you wrote about water and you've talked about water in different ways. Is that, when you talk about the four elements, is water the element that is your go-to, is kind of what we anchor to? Is that where would you say if I picked any element? For me, it's wind, but for you, is it water? I'm curious.
Oh, I don't have a favorite, but I will say that on the daily, that I feel like water does play a pretty huge role for me. I think, again, being a healer and washing my hands, not just pre-COVID, I was still washing my hands a lot. And after it being fairly empathic, I would sometimes pick up things that really weren't mine. I've since learned how to control that. But I found when I washed my hands that the cold water would just cut the energy, and that I wanted it to cut. And so I was spiritually interacting with water after every healing session. And still to this day, after long hours of healing work, water's the only thing sometimes that really just takes it all away and restores me. So I do have a really profound relationship with water. Yeah, but the ritual that I wrote about was gifted to me by Kathleen Daw, and she's one of my spiritual teachers. And it's a beautiful ceremony, and it means so much to me because it's all about the power of transformation, which nature offers us in abundance. And, in brief, when we take a stone and we breathe our problem into it and ask the spirit of the stone to please take this, and we face downstream of a river or a stream, and we just release it and cast it into the water and ask it to be transformed, to move away from us. And then when we're ready, we turn and face upstream, and we just invite what we want in its place. What is it I'm ready to accept now? What is it? What healing am I really ready to take on? And what do I want to be different now? And just opening to the new. And it's so easily done. This doesn't have to take a long time. Most of us can find a river or a stream, and it doesn't have to be a special stone, just any stone that you find. It's just a really powerful ritual, and it's one that I taught to my daughter when she was really little. And pretty much anytime I see a stream or a river, I'll pause to do that ritual. So I feel like it was a great one to share because it's been really powerful for me, and it's really accessible.
Yeah, that's, I love that, the release, but then, the sense of universe and horrors of vacuum with stuff. If you're letting something go, what are you feeling back in there? And this really does that. And one of the things that I really wanted to do with writing this book is not just tell our stories, because there's a lot of people out there who are skeptics, because I'm a skeptic as well. I mean, I've got a math, computer science, business background, I got an MBA. I've got, I work for a university. I mean, it's all about fact-based, information that I'm handing out all the time and sharing and everything. And so there's something though that rituals do for us and ceremonies do for us that we've taken out of our culture. Right, we used to always, there were so many rites and rituals and passages and things that we do, and we do some of the driver's license kind of thing and a marriage thing that we do in our culture, but there's not a whole lot more than that. There's no transition for a man or for a young boy to become a man. There's no rite of passage that way, or a young woman to become a woman. So we stumble into those not knowing, there's no transition point for us. There's no acknowledgement by community going, you've now moved into this. Or when something happens, even death in our culture, when we run from the two things in our culture, death and sex, anything with those things we run away from. And so they haunt us, right? And they keep poking at us, and they become our wounds in our dark, those things we hide in the dark. And these rites and rituals and ceremonies, because I recognize that if people are kind of on the edge, they pick up the book and start reading, it's like, wow, okay, I see all this stuff that you guys did, but I have no idea of how to do this myself, right? So it's like, well, let's give you some tools. Let's give you some starting points and some ideas. Yeah. And so, again, there's like 15 or 20 different rites, rituals, and passages in there, or ceremonies and so forth, that will give, hopefully, anybody who's interested in this at least some starting point, going, okay, that one is, doesn't seem too, like mine takes a little bit more concentration. I'm talking about creating a medicine wheel, essentially, and speaking to the stones and creating a fire and going around it and communing with, that's a little bit bigger practice than, I would say bigger because that's not the right word. It takes more time than what you're talking about with the water ceremony that we all have access to do with that. And so I love these ceremonies and rituals and rites, because those are the things that used to connect us together as community. It also gave us an understanding of when something happened, kind of what the expectation was around that, so we could feel safe, right? As long as we know what the expectations, like around death, how many of us have loved ones that pass, spouses or stuff that pass, and we don't know? We guilt ourselves in, well, I should not be interested in other people. I should not be putting myself, what's the right amount of time of grieving? How come I'm grieving too much? Maybe I'm not grieving enough. And it just goes on and on, because we don't have a practice in our culture. And studying different cultures and seeing how they go about death, it's like, oh my gosh, it's just so beautiful. Just so beautiful.
It's highly ritualized. Yeah. Well, you're moving into a subject that's really dear to my heart as a grief specialist and somebody who's worked as a hospice care volunteer and somebody who marries and buries and does baby blessings. I found that I really love that doorway where spirits are coming in and going out. I've worked as a doula, both for babies coming in, but also as a death doula for spirits as they're leaving this plane. And it's true, when we ritualize something, we sanctify it. And if we have rituals with nature, we're sanctifying nature. And again, we're going to be less likely to harm nature if we understand that we're not only a part of it, but we are it. And we're going to if we make it sacred, through a ritual, it's already inherently sacred. But if we bring the act of sacralizing something, then again, we're going to be much less likely to trash it. So that's why these rituals are also important, as we remember, as we're going into a ritual with nature, that nature is sacred, that we're sacred. And then we have a different relationality with that which we regard as sacred.
Yeah, I totally agree with you with that. And again, I just like so much, some of the, Richard Louv definitely talks from this more scientific standpoint of it, but I still do love the nature deficit disorder that we're moving into, that we're talking about, where kids are, so much on their, I was going to say, everybody has their phones next to them all the time. Mine's not even here in the room at all. So, but most of us have our phones or electronic devices with us all the time that, most for kids nowadays, whereas opposed to when we were growing up, we didn't have those to distract us. And we had the real gift of, the real blessing in my mind of letting nature be our teacher and to be creative in there and use our imaginations to create our worlds and hang out.
It was our playground. It was our playground. Absolutely. I think many of us, I grew up in the 70s, and it was really a feral childhood, which I didn't realize at the time, but we didn't have organized play dates. And, we grew up where it's kind of, you were just out, and when the street lights came on, you better get home. But we were invited, like, go, get out. If it was a nice day, boy, you better not be in the house. Your mom would say, why are you still in the house? It's a gorgeous day, get out. And nowadays it seems like there's more trepidation around that. And the world's unsafe, but it's always been unsafe. It's not like bad things didn't happen when I was growing up, but somehow we just, I don't know, that wasn't at the forefront. We didn't let it be. There was too much to see and do and experience. And yeah, that schism again, that removing ourselves from nature makes it easier to disregard it as something that isn't sacred. But when from a young age, we understand that it's sacred, again, we won't let that go. We'll fight for nature and stand up for good climate action.
Yeah, I think, that a lot of that probably started happening around the stranger danger stuff in the 80s that really started driving some of that. And so we became afraid, but, we saw people being taken away, kids disappearing. And again, the research just doesn't support that. I mean, it's no more now than it was ever. And same with violence and so forth. It's just that we see it so much more readily. And so we feel the world is a dangerous, unsafe, and then nature, of course, is a dangerous, unsafe kind of place, right? Because the only thing we get from that is the stories of somebody getting, lost, gnarled by a bear, or whatever it might be. So we become afraid of it because we don't know it. We don't have a relationship with it.
Right.
And as you mentioned, that means we don't have a part of a relationship with a part of ourself, right?
Right.
Which is
That's
huge.
right. There's a fear factory out there, and that's what often has the floor. It has the media. It has, all of that bandwidth. And it's so important that we tell the stories of nature where it was beautiful and it was healing, and it wasn't just where we got harmed or hurt. And those sensationalistic stories leave such a mark that, we can develop a fear of nature and the natural world instead of really just understanding that it can be beautiful and uplifting and actually, quite frankly, I think a lot safer to be out in nature than it is to be around people. And like with COVID, right? I mean, a lot of us found ourselves outside a lot more. Some of us were already there, and welcome to the party. We started seeing more people outside, right. And it's just beautiful that it got COVID. That's one of those silver linings of COVID, which is not to minimize at all the losses that have been incurred, but there have been some silver linings. And one of those is that we got out into nature more. We reconnected with nature again. And that's been something that I think some people have realized they were actually quite bereft of and really excited to return to.
Yeah, and I was going to mention that. I think as we get a bit older, and we've gone through the different phases. I guess I'll speak for myself, but I've heard it so many times from different people, and I see it in some of the different groups that I belong to. Is that longing of like, well, once I get this, I'll be happy. Once I make this much money, I'll be happy. Once I get the family, the 1.9 kids, I'll be happy. Once I have this vehicle, I'll be happy. And most of us aren't happy with the stuff because the stuff is not the richness of life. The stuff,
No.
the magic happens in connecting with each other, in connecting with our roots in nature, in being in service to others. And right. That's where the richness happens, but we think it's outside ourselves, and that all of this is inside us and able to be accessed there. And I think that's what people are longing for, again, coming back to those rites and rituals and ceremonies and those kind of things, because it helps glue us it creates that glue, if you will, kind of from that kind of connects us together and holds us, and we recognize that crucible that we're making together, that container that we're creating, that then holds us in there to some degree, right? And
absolutely,
I think that's really special. So I'm curious. I'm going to switch gears here a little bit, if that's okay with you. I'm curious what your earliest memory of kind of a sacred connection in nature was. I'm guessing as a younger, and I remembered as I reread your story, Asherah, that she grew up in Colorado. And I've been in Colorado for 30 years, and I was like, oh my gosh, you're a Colorado girl, just north of me by about an hour and a half. So I'm curious. Tell me, do you remember something that that really stands out for you that you'd like to share?
Yeah, absolutely. Two things. One, well, I love just saying you can take the girl out of the mountain, but you can't take the mountain out of the girl. I live in Massachusetts now, but I'll always be from Colorado, and the Rockies will always be just part of my bones. But I grew up in Colorado again, and I had this parcel, this little part of our backyard that my mother had just given to me, and it's like, that's yours. And it was so sacred to me because nobody else got to go there, not even my twin sister, who I had to share everything with. She had her own little corner of the yard. And so it was mine, and I could do anything I wanted. And I just remember just hours with my hands in the soil, and it was just pure magic for me. I don't even think I was planting anything. I just remember digging, I probably had a spade and was just digging around, and So it was so funny. Kids don't need much to be completely enchanted. And then my grandmother lived up in the Rockies, and she taught me how to track. And she would take me out early morning. She'd wake me up, and we would go out, and she would show me, see there under the tree where the grass is really flat. She said, a deer has slept there last night. And she's like, look here, do you see, their footprints? She said that was a mama deer and her baby. And that moment just got, sort of just deeply embedded in me as something so precious, to be able to read the signs in nature and understand that nature's communicating with us that way too, through the unseen, through the tracks. It's, and that's just as magical to learn how to identify tracks in the snow or the mud as it is to actually see the animal. So yeah, so many stories of growing up in Colorado. Like, camping out there was so wild compared to anything I've experienced in the East Coast. Like, it was just a sleeping bag and like a can of beans and some matches and a knife, and you were good to go. It wasn't glamping. It wasn't any of that. It was so bare bones and so magical. There was no tent. There was just you, and you could almost reach up and pluck the stars from the sky. It felt that you were that close to nature. So yeah, I'm super grateful for my intimacy with nature that I had growing up.
Well, that's great. What a gift. I mean, just hearing you talk about your mom saying, this is your spot over here. I mean, as a kid, where, like you said, where we don't have, even those of us who don't have twins, we don't feel much like anything is ours, right? It's all our parents' domain or whatever it may be, and they're in charge of us and telling us what to do and when to do it. And boy, what a powerful gift that your mother offered you. And was it your mom's mom who was your grandmother that you?
Yes, yeah, that was my mom's mom.
Wow, so grandma was a badass also. And
grandma was a blue domer, as my friend Juniper would taught me to say that, but she said, oh, she was a blue domer, right? Somebody who just sort of worships the blue dome of the earth. and she was that was where I knew she connected spiritually. Whenever I was outside with her, she just lit up. And she definitely regarded nature as something that was sacred and passed that right along.
Well, that's kind of cool to hear, because I'm sure you're passing on to Rosalie, like you said, with that. So it's at least 4 generations at least that's going down through the feminine line of the lineage.
Yes.
Pretty powerful. And boy, it just makes me so. The reason I asked the question about earliest memories with connecting in nature is because I think one of the gifts that we have as adults that we can give back, kind of like your mom and your grandma did, is that it doesn't have to be our own children. Certainly our children. I plugged my children in early on, and we went out and did all kinds of stuff in nature. But it's where else do we have opportunities to help plant those seeds for kids who are just as anxious and willing to dabble in that magic world as what we were in that creative land. So can we give them permission to do that? Can we, when we have the ability? That's part of our, and in my belief, that's part of what this book is hoping to invite people to do, as well as to reach out to the children around you, help them plant the seeds of nature in them, so that when they grow older, they, like you said, they respect it, they connect with it, they protect it and want to preserve it, not use it just as a commodity. And Steve Tromulak was talking about how he grew up in California, and his 7th grade teacher, and he remembered the guy's name. He talked about where they went. They went to the ocean, and they would go and he would name all the different, the guy would teach them about the different living organisms in the ocean, both plant, flora, and fauna with that. And he's like, I remember that. Like, I mean, I might forget something that happened a month ago or even last night, but those times were so embedded in him, that they're so planted in him and so anchored in him, and it opened up that wonder in him and to the natural world, that he eventually became a professor of wildlife and fisheries, for 35 years. So that's that legacy again, that place of where can we make a difference in the world. We think it's this big grandiose things that we have to do, but oftentimes it's the small things that we have control over, that we can make small changes in our immediate circle of influence there, and the more and more of us that do that, we definitely change the world and
Yeah.
the universe by that. So
Absolutely. And I back to nourishing and children, their relationship with nature. One thing that I would put out there is that if we just observe our children and where their passions and their instincts naturally take them, we can nourish what's already inside of them. Like from the time my daughter was super, super little, it was evident that she was a water baby. And so I just got her in any kind of water I could at any time. And now from the time she was maybe, I don't know, 7, 8, she declared she wanted to be a marine biologist, and she's never wavered from that. She's 15 and she's still gunning headlong toward that, and is super passionate about sea turtles and coral and, saving them both. And it's just, it doesn't take much if we just shine our light of attention on our children's natural instincts and passions. They'll just go. And especially if we never tell them that you can't do that, or you won't make money doing that, right? It's just follow your passion and the money will come, and so that's such a beautiful thing we can do, is just observe your child. And you can ask yourself, does my child seem to have more of a relationship with this element or that one, or even introduce your children to the elements and see where their own proclivities lie.
yeah, and I find that funny that you say that, because I asked you that question of which element are you most in tune with, and it's like you gave me the default. Oh, I like them all. They're all the same to me, kind of stuff. Like, oh, come on. So
Yeah.
But I agree. I mean, I think there's one that is more strong for us. It was interesting when I asked Steve this question. His response was, well, 3 of them are the same, but I have a really challenging relationship with water. It's like, wow, that's interesting. Given that I know you scuba dive, and I know that you and Joss live in Puerto Rico for half the year, you're choosing these things. They're not put upon you. You are choosing to go to places where water is there. It's like, I have a feeling that water is your greatest, one of your greatest teachers. Like, yeah, it has him be really present, because he has he's put himself in some situations where life or death is right there in the hands, and you don't turn your back on Mother Ocean.
No.
And so it's this really present moment. And that's one of the things, if we're really truly plugged in and being and letting our own nature be there, is being present, right? Really being present while we're there. And when we're present, then from my experience, there are so many things that are possible, so many questions that we have that can be answered, so much healing that can happen, so many insights that we can get, so many spiritual downloads and stuff that we can then take forward and gift back out to the world.
Yeah, and I love that you're bringing up presencing, because that is one of the gifts of just being still out in nature, is learning how to be fully present. In this day and age, our attention is often divided in a ton of different directions. And one thing about when we're out in nature is it tends to bring us down to more of a single pointed focus. Hiking, rock climbing, for example. I love rock climbing because you can't afford not to think about exactly what you're doing in that moment. Everything else falls away, and where is my hand going to go next so that I can grip onto something so I don't fall and die. And nature has that gift of bringing us into the present moment. And so it's the ultimate meditation, whether we're looking at a fire, or we're, just letting our body float in salt water, or we just let a breeze come and swoop through our hair. Or feel the earth under our feet. It just brings us into the present moment, which is ultimately, again, just the best healing thing ever, is to have our wickedly divided attention just slow down and become simple.
And again, it's that intention, right? Because there's an awful lot of people that I see in the trails here through Garden of the Gods and other places that have headphones on, that are, or going up the Manitou Incline, where it's like, how fast can I get up? Because I'm tracking my records. And that's a huge amount different than what you're talking about there.
Yeah.
And it's really about, you can be in nature and really be apart from it. You can go to a 10-mile trail and come out the back end and having not seen anything and not experienced anything, because you're so much in the wheels up here. I was like thinking, this work here and this thing here, and all of a sudden it's like, how did I get here?
Right. And so, I've seen that when my husband and I took our honeymoon in the 100-mile wilderness of the AT, and it was just the Appalachian Trail, and it was just amazing because there were some ultralighters. They were incredible. They were often like men in their 70s, and they would just go whizzing by us like so fast. I'd be like, what was that? And they were the ultralighters, because their packs weighed 10 pounds instead of our like 25-pound, 30-pound packs. And I mean, that's great. They're going fast and they're setting some kind of record. But for us, we were just kind of befuddled. Like, why would you want to go so fast through this? We were taking our time. We didn't hit most of our mile markers at all when we thought we would, because we were just drinking it in. And so yes, I think if we allow it to, and we do have to bring our conscious participation to it, it will help us be in the present moment and slow down.
Absolutely. Well, my friend, this has been rich and wonderful. Like I said before we got started here, I love these interviews because I just I get to step into the juiciness with each of the authors and kind of to get a better feeling. I mean, we've been in ceremony together numerous times, but we often don't sit down and just talk at this level. And what's driving you? Tell me a bit about your history and about your childhood, about these, about what's really driving you. So I love that these informal kind of conversations, right? It's a conversation about nature. And boy, for me, there's almost nothing that's richer than that in this whole world, other than maybe my children and grandchildren and wife with things. And by the way, Ariana told me to tell you hi.
Hi.
Thank you again.
That will be very fun. Thank you. Take care, everybody.